So welcome to the next class, Architectural Acoustics, and we're coming to this really interesting topic that I've announced, Psychoacoustics, and I think I've said something like you could probably get a whole degree packed and call it Psychoacoustics and still not cover all of it. It's a vast field of scientific research, and it has a very interesting history to it, and it has some really interesting conclusions for us as well. So maybe I'll start with a bit about history. It all started essentially on a surgeon's table with mice and kind of microscopic scalpers and cutting out their hearing organs. So this was about 100 years ago now. And actually one of the prominent figures there was Georg von Békésy, which I share some Hungarian ancestry with. Very proud of that. And he was the guy who, on top of cutting out the hearing organs of small mammals, he also stuck electrodes into the neural fibers, and he played really loud sound into the organs. Because these things, they tend to stay alive for a bit, and you can make sure that they do for a bit longer if you feed the cells with, I'm not even sure about all the details here. I'm not as sadistic. I've never cut animals in order to study psychoacoustics, but it's a worthwhile thing to consider how it all started. And the guy was a genius because he could track some neural activity in isolated hearing organs of mammals through essentially checking the potential in the neural fiber. So that's where it all started, and then it kind of got a bit more friendly, but still quite, how should I put it, surreal, because actually after that about 20-30 years of psychoacoustics went into analytical signals. Okay, so as soon as we had some oscillators, noise generators, things like this, a whole bunch of psychoacousticians went into determining different kinds of threshold. Okay, so these thresholds were typically determined on living humans, so slightly different department of investigation. And they came up with a huge amount of JNDs. JND is just noticeable difference. It's a kind of a crucial psychoacoustic abbreviation. And they came up with a whole bunch of graphs that also describe how we hear. Okay, so the point being that, you know, on that very basic level of hearing where you are dealing with analytical signals, there are certain things you hear, certain things you can't hear, and this can be determined. You take a whole lot of subjects, you average the results, and you say something like, okay, this is a characteristic of human hearing. Now, most of the conclusions we draw from these experiments, these domains of research, are actually hasted, in my humble opinion, because what you can say for a sine wave is not something you can say easily for a flute tone. So the point is that the hearing system is so extremely complex that these are actually rather different stimuli. And as with all psychology-related things, context is everything. Okay, so in many cases you can also imagine, well, if you're set there for 2 hours doing psychoacoustic measurements and you keep hearing sine tones and noise bands and you have to answer what you hear and what you don't, that after a while you lose motivation, right? If you've lost motivation, your hearing is also gone. I mean, you've probably had, you know, extremely motivated music listening in your life, that you remember as being miraculous because you heard all the detail and all the musical intent and everything was there just in front of you, fully occupying your perception. And then on another day you may have heard the same tune for that matter, and it just didn't give you that degree of detail, right? So there is a lot to say about motivation. Are you motivated enough to hear stuff? And especially in this, context, I would consider that one of the most important things to learn is to learn how to listen. Right? So if we're telling you, this is how you record, this is how you position the microphones, we're going into the position of speakers, all of these things may be useless recipes that you blindly follow unless you really know how to switch on your attent listening. And there is quite an interesting domain of research evolving around the term critical listening that I invite you to look into. I don't have the time to go very deep. It arises from more or less the French school of musique concrète. So after the Second World War, there were some radio stations with fairly free programming opportunities and some rather, avant-garde contemporary composers who got their hands dirty in the studios and started cutting tape and came up with different pieces and kind of exciting the whole environment of research in audio. It is really interesting to know that, most of the stuff that we use, for example, a compressor was essentially a technical solution to the limited bandwidth on a tape. I should say dynamic range on a tape. Okay, so, and then someone realized, some of the weird composers in the studio, that if they didn't do the inverse process, so they didn't do the expansion, the compressors in the old days came as two devices that were used together and only together. So you would compress your audio before putting it on tape, and then when you're playing it back, you're expanding it. In fact, maybe some of you or some of your dads have an old cassette tape and you have these Dolby noise reduction things as well. And you might know, or your dad probably knows, that if you record with a certain Dolby setting, you have to play back with that Dolby setting, right? Because there is an in process to the tape process and off the tape process. So that was a technical solution for dynamic range. And then one of the weird composers came in and said, well, what happens if I don't use the expander, I use just the compressor? And then he realized that suddenly you hear a bit more detail in the material, things start to get weird, and from there, the compressors came to be what they currently are. So in most of these situations, in these early days of essentially radio studios, a lot of this stuff has started to be developed, including what I started with is the critical listening ideas, Pierre Schaeffer and the others who were also philosophical, not just technically challenging the technicians in the studio, but also kind of dealing with the ideas that surround these practices. Because in a way, I mean, part of this musique concrète actually has to do with the fact that if you listen very carefully, you can hear a huge amount of detail. And if you hear a huge amount of detail and you are musically inclined, you can feel music, so to speak, which is something that we don't really consider. I mean, if I tell you guys, okay, sit back and hear the music, which is the noise of the projector fan. I mean, depending on your state of mind, some of you might be like, okay, I can do that for an hour. But most likely you won't be doing it. Or, for example, if you're waiting on a bus, actually the soundscape that surrounds you, the amount of detail in your auditory surrounding is huge. And if I ask you, okay, so what did you hear of that huge amount of detail at the bus stop this morning, or anyway you came here, you probably have no clue. You probably didn't notice a single sound. Okay, so that's the interesting thing. And I'm not saying, well, just walk around and hear all the sounds constantly and be amazed by it. Go for it if you like. What I'm saying is, it is something that we may learn how to control. Okay, and obviously fatigue is a factor, right? So even if you're doing your favorite track in a studio, after 5 hours you can't hear it. Motivation is a factor. There's a lot of factors to it. But what I'm trying to say here is, don't assume that you hear what is audible. In order to hear what is audible, you need full attention, full motivation. You need to be there completely. Okay? Now, what is it that we hear? So we're kind of going into psychoacoustics slowly. Actually, the first thing that you perceive from all of your sensory inputs is whether it's a threat or not. Okay, so if there is a seriously threatening sound, like for example, you hear the lights above you cracking in the way that they will suddenly drop, you will, I'm not trying to get you worried, they're probably safe, but you will escape before you even know what happened. I mean, if it's like a slow crackling, okay, you're kind of attent. But if the roof is falling in, you are escaping before you know what you're escaping from. Okay, so in the way the mind operates, there are much quicker responses than the cognitive response. Right, so it's the same thing, you know, you knock on your knee and it jumps, or you step on something sharp, on a Lego, whatever. So the response is much quicker in many cases than the cognition. So actually, in psychoacoustics, obviously there is the threat thing, which is the fastest of all responses. But actually, the funny thing with hearing is that source recognition has primacy over detail. Okay, and this is something you can figure out evolutionarily. You know, I really need to know whether it's a lion or a cat purring, right? In the bush, much more so than I need to know whether, you know, it's that or this lion, or whether there is a resonant cavity nearby, you know, or anything else that you might hear through paying attention to the detail. Okay? So our source recognition kicks in really quick before the detail is available to cognition. And this is actually the biggest hurdle. Okay? And again, you know, you might be drooling on the couch at some point. You know, consider that. Can you get rid of the source recognition? Please don't use heavy drugs to achieve this. Because you can. You can drug the part of the brain that does this, and then all the sounds are completely new, never heard before, and all the rest. But in a normal functioning state, you will recognize the sources of the sound, and it won't excite you much. It's like, okay, well, that's just the noise of the projector fan. Done with, right? But if part of your brain is off, then it's like, what is it? There's so much detail in that noise. Oh my God, it actually has an undulation, slow undulation over time. What could that be? You know, so what I'm saying is that obviously I'm, you know, taking the piss of drug abuse as well. Don't do it. But I'm trying to highlight that our, you know, default state of mind in terms of sound perception is just not serving us well in this evolutionary moment where we study music tech, right? It served us very well in the bushes. Yep.
Sorry, I'm not taking this. What drugs do you mean?
I don't know actually. I have no clue what you could take, but I think psychedelics have the effect of making everything totally new.
Yeah, I don't know. Is that why music sounds different?
Probably. I really am no expert in this domain. I just take the piss of it. I mean, you're probably aware that, you know, most music producers are heavy on that stuff for some reason.
Yeah, I didn't know if you meant like more like recreational drugs or something else.
Well, the thing is with recreational drugs, as far as I understand the topic, the biggest issue is that it messes up your reward systems. So typically recreational drugs, including booze as well, they make you feel really rewarded. And the issue is that they take over your reward system and you stop being rewarded from anything else in life at some point if you really push it, right? So in that sense, it's definitely related, because if you feel the reward, if you're in the rewarded state, you are heightened, you know, spiritually, and you want what you have. You kind of get a really immediate relationship with your environment. So yes, I think they could help your motivation in that sense, but it has a short-term, mid-term, long-term consequence that you might not want to have. So if you can do this just by the power of your self-motivation, do that, right? And obviously there's tons of antidepressants now on the market as well, which do a similar thing. They kind of make you feel rewarded, and it's dangerous because, you know, you can lose reward from other domains in life. Okay, so think about this recognition. Okay, can you do it? In fact, you could do it in 10, 20 minutes or half an hour when you've had enough of this lecture and I'm still going. You can try to hear my voice without understanding what I'm saying. And with my accent, it might not be that difficult either, right? So just try to hear the melody, the undulations, the amplitude going in and out, the articulation. You can do this potentially by imagining the motion that is responsible for this sound. There is a very tight link neurologically between visual system and the auditory system, and all the other systems, by the way. But you can work on this one. When you hear a sound, try to visualize the source of the sound. And when you hear a sound which is dynamic in nature, like speech, you can visualize something that, you know, kind of opens, closes, changes shape, these things. You may be able to occupy your mind with visualization and actually not hear, not understand what I'm saying. Okay, so understanding of the words comes rather close to source recognition. Okay, so, and that's your critical listening. I mean, it's just something that, you know, some people have it. Maybe they've trained it, maybe they have it by default. But it's peculiar, you know. You can make a huge amount of tests whereby I ask you, okay, is there an artificial reverb on this recording? It's really tricky to hear out. I probably wouldn't score very high myself. I'm more kind of technical abstraction minded than true perception minded. But those guys who are truly perception minded, you know, they just do it, you know, and it's not something you can't train. So if you know that you're more cognitively orientated, more into the abstract stuff, more thinking than perception, be aware of perception being something you can train. Okay, so that's the kind of intro I'd like to put in terms of contextualizing what it's all about, why it's interesting for us. And I'll probably remember more anecdotes and funny things in the meanwhile, but I will start with essentially going really superficial and really quickly over huge chapters, just so you know what there is to know in psychoacoustics, or indeed what are the main areas of research that are pertinent to what we're doing here. If anyone's interested, actually I probably will remember to post. If anyone's interested in the neurology of things, which is not here, it is extremely complex. We're still not through with it. An interesting fact is that a visual system has more neurons, but has less layers. Whatever that might make you intuit about the auditory system. But indeed, face recognition, computerized face recognition is more advanced than computerized voice recognition. So there is something about audition which is more complex. There is something about vision which is more vast. It's a kind of a broader bandwidth channel, so to speak. But audition is hugely complex. And if you get into the neurology, you know, all the nuclei in the brain stem, there's a huge amount. There is tons of research going into this, what happens on which level. And I'll just say a few things in terms of introducing these levels, just so you have an idea. I mean, for audition, it's tricky. It's very tricky because due to the amount of layers, you get the finished baked cake, you know, served. You recognize the source and you understand the speech, and all that went into this, which is hugely complex, is not available to your attention. That's why, you know, going deeper into audition is much more exciting than going deeper into vision. I mean, what is it about vision? Well, actually, I can watch the shadow of you projected on that wall, and I can figure what is the sharpness of that shadow. You know, there's a lot of things I can observe in detail in vision, but it's actually much more available, you know. Even though I don't see pixels, right? It's a similar thing. I get the recognition striking first. So I first recognize some of you guys before I see what kind of shadow you project on the wall. But to reach into the detail, it takes much less effort. I just need to stare in that direction and kind of pay attention. With audition, it's slightly more complex because, you know, it kind of strikes you as a complete sensation, and dissecting it is a bit more complex. Now, just to give you an idea about these layers, it is easier to talk about vision. So in vision, for example, you will have, after the layer where you kind of get the pixels, you will get a line recognizing a layer. Or actually, I should probably say first a contrast recognizing layer, then a line recognizing layer, then an outline recognizing layer, right? If I show you this, you immediately see the outline. Right? You can reach into perceiving the pixels and the contrast between this and the background, but actually you see the outline. In fact, you see the cup, right? So what strikes you first is already a very high level perception. And in this case, it's fairly accessible. So after the outline, right, probably comes some kind of depth perception, right? You kind of figure out that it's not, you know, at the wall, it's not in your face, there is a distance of it to you, and much, much more in terms of color and all the rest. So each of these steps is actually a layer of neurons proper busy with stuff. Okay, and then the interesting thing about vision is that it is rotation insensitive. I mean, I don't know if any of you have, you know, thought of complex algorithms in terms of tracking objects, you know, but to track an object based on the shape and the kind of contrast to the background is fine. But to make this rotation insensitive, tricky, right? So this is also not a given. This is a very complex neurological process. Okay? So if you want to study the neurology of it, please do. I will post on a Blackboard. There is about 7-8 lectures in medical school on physiology of perception. And actually, it's a full module, and I think there's 8 lectures on vision, 8 on audition. And there's a huge amount of neurological terminology that you don't really want to remember, probably. But it's definitely an eye-opener. It's a kind of a perspective. You know, it gives you the perspective, okay, this is what it's about. This is what it takes for me to hear stuff. It's hugely complex. Okay, so that's one thing that I don't even have on the slides, although it's probably the freshest and the most exciting thing. But it's fairly important that we establish what is, you know, standard psychoacoustics. And these are the bits that are typically all derived from test sounds, analytical signals, noise and signs and impulses. And therefore, you know, take it with a pinch of salt. It's great to have an idea of what may happen, what may be a feature of audition, but don't take it for granted that if this happens to a sine wave, it has to happen to a flute as well. Okay, so first of all, physiology. This is your ear. obviously, we're not taking theoretical exams in this. You don't have to learn the Latin terms. The interesting thing for us, probably, is the impedance transformation that happens. Okay, so we've studied acoustics, and you understand that an abrupt change of impedance produces a reflection. Okay, so an abrupt increase in impedance is this wall for a sound, but an abrupt decrease in impedance may be this, right? So if I'm talking into a tube, when the wavefront exits the tube, there is a sudden impedance drop, which will produce a reflection back into the tube. Okay, and if it is not as sharp, so if I have a flare, then more energy will be projected out, less energy will be reflected, and you will hear it better, right? That makes sense. So the issue is that the basilar membrane, so you're probably aware that we have this snail-looking thing, and inside there is the basilar membrane, which is responsible for essentially frequency analyzing, spectral analysis, more or less. It is suspended in liquid. By the way, the minuteness of these motions is just crazy. I mean, it's the precision. I mean, we are still hearing much better than any old microphone can do, right? So, you know, even with all the tech these days, this tech is just superior by far. So it has evolved such that the membrane is in a liquid, which means that we would need to have an airborne vibration be transmitted to a liquid, and there is a necessarily abrupt impedance boundary as the wavefront enters the liquid. In fact, if you have the surface of a liquid, it is very reflective. Right? If you can do this test in the bathtub, or once you go for holidays to Mexico in January, if you are submerged and someone talks above the water, you really can't hear almost anything. But if they drop into the water and talk there into the water, you will hear it much better. Okay, so it is the surface of the water that is really reflective and does not allow the sound to enter into the next medium. So actually the little hammers, the bones, malleus, are responsible for impedance transfer, or I should say, what's the right term there? For circumventing the issues with the impedance. Okay? So what happens there is that you have one membrane, and then the bones are connected to that membrane. There's three bones which are mechanically connected, and they connect to another membrane which is already touching the liquid. Okay, so there is actually a mechanical transfer between air and the liquid. Interesting. Without this, we wouldn't be able to hear at all. There wouldn't be enough acoustic energy entering the little snail. You probably know that it's also responsible for our balance with the three kind of rings there and all the rest. In fact, it's quite interesting to note how the sense of balance is connected with hearing. I won't go into that. But in any case, the interesting thing about this system is that it's essentially a huge amount of filters. Can be described as a huge amount of filters. And the thing that is a bit more recent in terms of what we know is that it is not only the basilar membrane which has your spectral, how should I put it, resolving mechanism. Actually, the auditory nerve has certain threads which will be more sensitive to different frequencies as well. So back in the day, if you read a bit of an ancient text, what they will say is that the basilar membrane is responsible for all of it. And then the rest is the brain, which is a simple, you just hear what's audible, right? But then, more recently, we actually have the science to support the fact that it's much more complex down the line as well. Okay, I'll come to the ear. So this is the list of things. Cochlear membrane, basilar membrane, these are interchangeable terms. But I will talk about this once I get to frequency perception or pitch perception. There is a decent amount of papers written about modeling peripheral processing. So that whole thing that you saw was peripheral auditory system. In terms of what kind of filter, what does it do, what happens, what is the compression characteristic. It's interesting to see because it kind of describes what it does acoustically. But actually one of the important things to note is that hearing is an active system. Okay, so I will say a bit more detail when we are at the pitch perception. But one of the important things is your stampedius reflex. So what happens is that if you hear a really loud sound, the bones that I was talking about, the little bones, they have muscles around them and they will contract and stop the bones from exerting large motion. So we have an active system of protecting our hearing. The issue with this that it takes, well actually I probably should know this, but I have no clue. It's probably a few hundred milliseconds, but at least 100, I would think, that it takes to kick in. So the point is that if you gradually enter a really loud environment, or the sound gradually becomes painfully loud, the active reflex will save you. But if it happens in a split second, then it won't have the time to kick in and you can seriously damage your hearing. Okay, so be aware of that. So that's just one of the aspects, and then the active bit about pitch perception will come in a minute. Okay, so the first main thing that psychoacousticians dealt with is loudness perception. So how loud is something? So you can already start to think, well, how do you even talk about this? I mean, if you think about it, there seems to be not a single word that we have which is used to describe sound exclusively. So we have onomatopoeia. So if I say the microphone is hissing, okay, the word hiss sounds like the sound I'm hearing. So we have quite a lot of those, like growling, boomy. These words actually sound like what you're trying to describe. And all the other words that we use to describe sound are borrowed from other perceptual domains. You know, it sounds warm. You know, it sounds fat. You know, tactile, visual. There seems to be no real sound describing word which is a kind of an abstracted word, which is not directly related to the sound. And that also highlights the fact that sound is, it's probably one of the main reasons why I'm so crazy about sound, because you can't grab it. You know, there is nothing you can do. I mean, I even have the idea that you can't record sound. Did I tell you about this? I should spend some time with this, because it's actually related to psychoacoustics. So what I had for about 2 months set up is a bunch of cymbals. I'm a bit of a cymbal freak. And a bunch of microphones. And just a pair of Genelecs, you know, near field arrangement. Very neat. And I could actually go from one setup to the other without moving the chair, right? I just needed to rotate to go from one to the other. So I had a really quick turnaround in terms of figuring out which microphones do what, positioning does what, all the rest of it. So I spent 2 months with it, and my conclusion was that recording is impossible. Okay, so no matter the fact that I can record a sound and produce music, beautiful detailed sound from the speakers based on that recording, or just playing a good recording through the speakers, it's just not it, right? And I had a good range of expensive microphones, good sound card, all the rest. I mean, the audition room wasn't great, but you know, near field situation normally helps these things. So the point is that I've talked about this briefly when I talked about point source paradigm. Okay, so a microphone is a point receiver, a speaker is a point source. So you get acoustical wavefronts which are rather simple. You see, you remember the analogy with the sea, right? So if I want to describe the surface of the sea, and what I do is I measure the elevation at a single point in space over time, I'm just not describing the sea, am I? So you can imagine the acoustic field to be a three-dimensional sea surface. And what am I doing? Well, I'm measuring in a 1 point. So it's not even one dimension across a two-dimensional surface. It is 1 point in terms of pressure, so pulsation, at 1 point in relation to a 3D field. So the amount of complexity that resides in an acoustic field is just huge in relation to the amount of complexity that can be encoded with even 100 microphones. Okay? So, and our perception does give us clues to this. Okay, so if you are actually in front of a cymbal and you pay attention to the richness of this sound, it is amazing. Every cymbal is a universe. Don't get hooked. You know, ask assistance, you know, before you ask your pharmacist or someone, can I engage with cymbals? It's dangerous. And this thing that comes out of the speaker, nah. It's just never can have that amount of detail. It's just ruled out altogether. Okay? So recording is great, but it's impossible. Okay, so you cannot actually take the complexity of an acoustic field of an instrument and just, you know, consider, oh, well, it plays, right? It's coming out of the speaker. Yeah, I recognize it. Nah, not even close. So I started this, that's briefly my recording is impossible joke. But coming back to the loudness, so I've started with saying that, you know, we don't really have words to describe loudness. And if you say, well, that's rather loud, okay, right? So it's not something that we can easily quantify. So if you think about the kind of experiments that may have been performed, it is typical a comparison. Is this louder than that? Okay, and then you can kind of, with all these relative claims, you can get to something which is nearing the absolute. But it's still problematic, especially with loudness perception. I'm a bit of a black sheep among the psychoacousticians because I fully disagree with the idea that it makes sense to come up with a scale of loudness, which is sounds, I will talk about it in a second, which determines what is twice as loud as something else. You know, I mean, if you ask me whether one thing is louder than another, okay, that makes sense. But if you say, how many times is this snare louder than the other snare? Or this white noise louder than the other? Well, I can say it is much louder, it's a bit louder. But to try and achieve precision in terms of it is exactly twice as loud, in terms of psychoacoustics, is very problematic. So what we have then is between our ability to measure dB, which is something you've done, and our ability to perceive variety in terms of loudness, there is a lot of complexity. I won't go into all the details here. Worth noting is that all of it is connected, okay? So believe it or not, we kind of done this experiment. It's a bit of a strange one. We're not going to be building experiments here, but interesting to note that the big psychoacoustical books will tell you that the threshold of, or essentially I should say that the loudness depends on sound duration. Okay, so that's an interesting claim. And supposedly if a sound is shorter than 0.2 seconds, then shorter sounds will appear to be louder. Okay, so you can measure these things. Again, it's a lot of flimsy psychoacoustical experiments, but the point is that there is also a claim that the pitch depends on loudness. So actually, everything depends on everything in terms of your perception, but in terms of measuring it with analytical signals, these are rather small differences. Now, if you want to extrapolate this in, you know, the context of working in a studio, then the point is that things actually depend a lot on each other. Huge amount. And one of the things that I challenge you to do, and we're gonna be doing a bit of blind testing in the practical, which is a kind of a main thing in psychoacoustics. And the reason is that if you know what you're hearing, you will hear it differently. Okay, this is how hearing is connected with knowledge, right? If I can fool you very easily about a compressor that costs £10,000 in relation to a plug-in, even with the speakers, you can be fooled totally and completely. Just by, giving you the suggestion that you know what you're hearing, all the blind testing will prove that your knowledge has modulated your conviction about what you're hearing. Okay, so one of the challenges I may propose to you guys is, I guess you are working on snare drums. Is there anyone who can work for an hour on a single snare drum? Half an hour, yeah? But 5 minutes. I think everyone has played with the snare drum. I mean, not physically, but in the DAW with the snare drum with 5 minutes. So I challenge you, take the initial bad sounding snare drum, take your kind of first two effects, like, off-hand process, and then take maybe 3 like really crafted sounds that you produce from a snare drum, and then stick it back into the whole track and get someone to help you with the blind test. And you might be surprised that you don't hear, the thing that you spent an hour with. It is very curious. I teach psychoacoustics in Hungary as well, and one of the students there, he knows I'm also into analog stuff and all the rest. And at one point he drops me a mail and says, I found this plugin, you won't believe it. It sounds exactly like the actual hardware. And no, it was the other way around. He said he could hear the difference. In any case, he sent me a mail and it's like, listen. And I'm like, well, I'm half deaf. I played a bit too much drums and cymbals throughout my life. My listening ability I'm not proud of, but have a listen to these. So what I've done is I've taken 2 of his files that he sent me and I duplicated them 4/4 and changed the names into A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, whatever, and send it back to him. It's like, okay, now you tell me which one is which. And he had a 50% error, which matches the random guess. So he was totally convinced that he could hear it, and he wanted me to say, oh yeah, I hear it or I don't hear it. But if I don't have someone to blind test me, then myself, I cannot make a valuable claim. So the best thing you can do is help someone get the blind test on themselves. Okay? So blind testing is the mother of it all anyway. Okay, so in terms of loudness perception, one really important thing to, remember forever, that the bandwidth largely influences our perception of loudness. Okay, spectral bandwidth. So if you remember, again, someone must have a hi-fi dad, and that dad has a really old hi-fi amp, which has the loudness button. Did this ever puzzle you? Why the hell do you have a loudness button when you have the volume dial as well? So, and what does the loudness button do? Well, it gives you a kind of a smiley EQ. It pushes the bass and it pushes the highs. And the reason why it's called loudness is because if you are not a studio technician, what you will perceive is a louder music. What happens technically is that the bandwidth grows, and thereby the sensation of loudness grows as well. Okay, and this is something that we have more accurate experiments to verify, and it all goes into critical bandwidth, which I will talk about in a second. And the experiment goes as follows. You have an increasing bandwidth of noise such that the energy of the signal is constant. So you kind of go from a sine wave to a narrow band noise to a wide band noise, but the energy of the signal is constant. The funny thing that happens is as you cross the bandwidth at around a third octave, depending on frequency by the way, but at around a third of the octave you will suddenly hear a jump increase in loudness. Okay, so there is this funny threshold, and if the bandwidth is larger than this threshold, which is what we call a critical bandwidth, then your sensation of loudness is increased no matter the fact that the energy of the signal is constant. Okay, so it's a very kind of low-level experiment, just the noise, and it works. Okay, so what this has to do, we propose typically, not sure about actual evidence here, but it has to do with hair cells. So I should have talked about hair cells at physiology, but I'll come back to it. So they sense the excursion of the membrane. And the point is that if more cells are excited, you get a larger sense of loudness. Okay, so the bandwidth is directly related to your loudness perception. Now, on top of that, we have loudness curves. You've probably seen these before. So they describe how loud is something that we hear. So the way to read this is look at a single line, and a single line will actually describe the equal loudness contour. It is the equal loudness contour. So it means that if you read the line, if you figure out what is the frequency, handy if you can read that below. So if you read the frequency, then you can read what is the actual SPL at that frequency, which will appear that loud. So you, for example, can see, I don't know, something random, that if you hear something at 1.5K here at 50 dB, or actually I should say 50 phones. So loudness unit in psychoacoustics, this one is called phones. So if I hear 50 phones at 1.5K, this actually matches 50 dB SPL. So you see they're kind of aligned at this frequency. But actually I will hear a signal to be of the same loudness at 40 Hertz. Let me track this. At 40 Hertz, only if it is 28 dB louder. Okay? So at 1.5K, a sine wave appears 25 dB softer. Sorry, I should say louder than the 40 Hertz sine wave. Okay, this is a sine wave. Again, take it with a pinch of salt. So that's interesting, right? So we need to exert much more acoustic energy in the low end in order to make it audible. But the interesting thing as well is that these curves are dynamically varying, right? So it won't be the same difference between 40 hertz and 1.5K at a low listening level and at a high listening level. Who wants to exercise their analytical ability and tell me how? How is this different at louder listening levels from soft listening levels? So what you see then is that the curve, which corresponds to loud listening levels, the curves on top, they're flatter. So there's less of a difference. Okay, so it won't be 27 dB, it will be somewhat less. Okay, so actually you kind of see that, especially at low listening levels, the bass has to be much louder. So what does this tell you? Well, it tells me, it gives me a justification to get 10 kilowatt system for my mastering session if I'm doing club music. Okay, so if I am listening at really loud levels in a club and listening at medium listening levels with midfield monitors, listening softly, I will hear a completely different spectral balance. This is a matter of fact. In fact, it's interesting, as a kid I was hanging around club DJs. My brother was one of them and they picked me up for some reason. They hated me initially, but then I don't know, I was just hanging around sufficiently. And, you know, and I was hanging around them, you know, new records. It was back in Budapest in the 90s. It was a great time because suddenly Hungarians got their passports in the 90s. And there was a lot of guys just straight off to Berlin and Vienna, just bringing back tons of records. It was really beautiful. We had like all the club music represented at a fairly high level. And, you know, I was hanging around these record shops, and I'm like, I really like this track. And then my brother goes, yeah, but it won't sound good in a club. And I'm like, what do you mean? Okay, this was my early kind of sense, okay, something's going on here. And it is. You know, it's just a different tune. You know, so actually my mastering solution is probably this PA right here. You know, if you can get your club track to play really loud through this PA and sound all right in this horrible room, thumbs up. Okay? So you will really need to remove a whole lot of detail. You know, you really have limited dynamic range. You have to make sure that things come through in a completely different way. You know, you actually have to make sure that the room becomes audible. I mean, that was my early experience with club music. There are certain clubs or DJs or tracks, and you enter the club and suddenly you feel like the space is larger than what it actually is. Right? Consider going to one of the Bristol clubs. We have some analysis coming up on that. And, you know, and suddenly you feel squashed. Suddenly you feel like the sound is suffocating you. It's like, ooh. Right? And consider that it could be really loud also, but actually open the space. So that was my kind of early set of metaphors to describe what the hell may be going on, what the hell may you be able to do, you know, what needs to be done. Okay, so loudness, very, very interesting. And especially, I mean, we're not even looking at the distortion characteristics. You know, the ear distorts. What is distortion? Distortion is the appearance of harmonics. Okay? And that's another thing which is, again, strictly psychoacoustic related. I can likely create a sound which has less energy and appears louder to you just by distorting it. Okay, so the distortion, which is a nonlinearity, what it does, it induces harmonics. And the presence of harmonics is how I assess loudness. In fact, I shouldn't say loudness, I should say intensity. Okay? So, and that's really interesting. You see, the volume knob is a very deceiving thing, and you probably know it by now if you're kind of, you know, sequencing stuff, that, you know, if you make one electronic sound source loud and then soft again, you don't get the articulation of intensity. If you do the same thing but you take it through a saturator or some distortion, you're getting there. If you do the same thing but the softer variant has high frequencies rolled off, again you're coming closer to articulating intensity. Okay, so our sensitivity to this phenomenon is huge. Okay, I immediately notice if there is an anomaly between the actual volume, the high frequency content, and the amount of harmonics. A natural sound source has these characteristics tightly interlinked. And my neurology really knows how to recognize this. And as soon as I electronically produce a sound, it's breaking these rules. It's breaking this connection of loudness, harmonics, high frequency content. So the point is that if I want to articulate dynamics in that fashion, I really need to craft the dynamic range of an electronic instrument. Or, I mean, I could be a Kraftwerk fan and, you know, just really go with the, you know, 70s, 80s aesthetic, whereby the repetition of the sound is the point of it, right? But, you know, ever since we had Aphex Twin and Square Pusher, it's probably about 20 years now, that the electronic sound sources have been developed such that they have the intensity articulation which is superior to an acoustic instrument. It actually gives you a sense of, you know, doing more than the acoustic instrument rather than doing less. Okay, so this kind of, and this actually links back to source recognition. You see, because that's the power of it, because if you're good at crafting these intensity articulations, then what you do is you essentially make it such that two different sound sources are classified as the same sound source. Right? So that's the point, that if your sound recognition kicks in and tells you, well, there is 4 snares in this and they're all over the place, it's a completely different musical phenomenon compared to hearing it as a 1 snare that does a whole lot of interesting articulation. Okay, so that's really interesting. And in fact, from psychoacoustics, you can learn what are the basic principles of sound source recognition. In fact, the grouping of stimuli into a single sound source. Okay, so these are quite interesting, I would think. Okay, well, I'm an hour through. I have a whole lot more. I feel that you guys are having it already. So I'm gonna jump over the, you know, the technicalities and focus more on the interesting stuff, and just mention things that are, you know, that make you knowledgeable in the domain. We had sounds which were derived from these ancient equal loudness contours, but then we have phones as well, which are the ones that are supposed to do the double loudness thing, which I'm not convinced about. Here is loudness versus bandwidth. Okay, I kind of deliberately spelled it out, so when it comes back again, you are reminded of it, and now you see it. Okay, so at 1 kilohertz, it would be a different graph at different frequencies. As you increase the bandwidth of a signal, which has a fixed sound pressure level, your perceived loudness, phones, will be stable until you reach the edge of the critical band, and then it will start increasing. Okay? So this is experimentally drawn relationship between bandwidth and loudness. Okay, masking. You probably heard this. It's rather complex. We can attempt to make it slightly more straightforward. But actually I won't spend time with this. The fact is that if a sound is softer and higher frequency in relation to another sound, then that sound may not be audible in the presence of the other louder low frequency sound. As soon as you switch off the lower louder sound, you suddenly hear the softer higher sound. You switch it back on and you don't hear it anymore. Okay, so it's a very straightforward thing that you can measure fairly accurately. Do you hear a sound or not? Press a button when you hear a different sound, and then you get these curves. Okay, so they kind of describe the fact that it's slightly asymmetrical. So the fact that a lower sound is more likely to mask a higher frequency sound. But actually, it could happen in the other direction as well. So what this means, if there is something really loud, we don't hear the soft bits anymore, especially if they're near in frequency. What does this mean? You know, mixing for clubs is a totally different ballgame. Okay? What does it also mean? It means that producing music which has detail is a mind-boggling mystery with no solution whatsoever. And I think all the people who can do it, they can do it. They cannot explain how it's done. They can tell you about the tools, about the process, but one thing is able to be able to hear it, first main thing. Second thing is spend a few years crafting your ability to get detail in a complex music. I mean, even a piano recording. How do you make a piano recording which has a lot of detail? Bugs me forever, probably. Okay? So masking is quite an important thing, just so you know it's a matter of fact. If something is loud, you don't hear the soft bits anymore. Okay, a bit more about critical bands. I won't go into this. Now, there is a very important thing about pitch perception that I will spend a little bit of time on. So you understand, and you can watch if you're interested, there's lovely videos of basilar membrane moving. The way the basilar membrane encodes sound, it's actually narrowing as it progresses from the base. Okay, so the base is stiffer and the end of it is looser if you kind of unfold it from the spiral. And the way it works is that the high frequencies excite the membrane close to the base, and the lower frequency excite the membrane towards the end of it. Okay, so that's how it kind of, you know, dissects, spectrally analyzes the incoming acoustic energy. And then what you get is that you have hair cells on both sides of the membrane, and when the membrane makes an excursion, the hair cell gets it, sends down action potential down the nerve fibers. Now, the interesting thing is that there is an active component to pitch perception, such that you have inner outer hair cells. I won't go into detail, but the point is that if I am trying to accurately hear a pitch, you see the way the membrane moves is kind of averaging things out quite a bit. I mean, you can imagine a physical membrane. It won't just give you a very sharp spike such that you can recognize a fairly accurate frequency. But what it does is that the hair cells on the side of the spike, they dampen the membrane there. So actually there is a way in which your membrane starts to have sharper peaks due to a feedback mechanism, a neurological feedback mechanism. So you recognize what you're after, and I think it's still questionable how far up the brainstem it goes and whether it reaches the auditory cortex or not. But the point is that you have a feedback path, neurological feedback path, that makes the membrane more accurate, more spiky, by suppressing motion around the peak. Okay? And that's really exciting because you can train these things, right? And some of you probably can whistle the tone of the bulldozer outdoors. Most of us probably can't. The point is that this mechanism, whereby we call this tonotopic transformation, so from the tone to position. Topology, you know this term? Topos is position. So tonotopic means from frequency to position. That's what happens. On top of this tonotopic mechanism, we also have a spiking synchronicity mechanism. So it's kind of came later in the history of psychoacoustics, the recognition that in order to perceive pitch, it's not sufficient for us to have the excursion of the basilar membrane. What happens is that the firing of the neurons goes in sync when there is a strong periodicity to the signal. Because what actually happens at the membrane, it's not that it just produces a spike when there is a frequency. It produces an amplitude of vibration. And that membrane actually vibrates at that frequency, right? So if I'm perceiving 100 hertz, then the membrane goes up and down at 100 hertz, and the hair cells are sensing that, and it's going up and down radically in a spatially constrained position. Okay? And the interesting thing is that the synchronicity of neural firings breaks down at around 3 kilohertz. Actually, some say 2, some say 4. Somewhere in that area, the neurons are not capable to synchronize, and the firing is all over the place. And funny thing, our pitch perception stops there. Okay, so I can hear that a sound source has a fixed frequency at 6 kilohertz. I hear a fixed frequency tone at 6 kilohertz, but I cannot figure out what its pitch class is, whether it's a C, D, or E. I cannot figure out a musical interval above 3-4 kilohertz. So the musical perception of pitch is something that has this threshold, and in all likelihood that's tightly related to the synchronicity of neural spiking. Now, because pitch perception is so complex, so you see there's 2 domains from which it feeds, the matter of fact is that there are a lot of sounds that different people will consider to be of different pitch. Okay, so frequency is a technical term, has to do with the fixed period duration. Pitch is a psychoacoustic term. It is our ability to recognize a musical pitch. Beautiful, I love detuned stuff. So it's a different thing. So again, you see, I hope that, you know, coming away from this, you will start to use these terms well, and, you know, say spectral components instead of frequency, say pitch when it's a musically related thing, say frequency when it's need to be said, all of these things. So for us, pitch is a crucial thing, and the point is that bell-type sounds, well, maybe even this, well, it's not very loud, it's about to break. Can I take it off? Let's see. It's a bit like a cymbal. Oops. It's actually a great example. So with this, actually the kind of pitch I perceive depends on where I strike it as well. But the funny thing with this, the way this experiment goes, is you get a recorded sound like this typically, and then you get an oscillator with a frequency dial. And the task is to tune the oscillator to match the pitch of the bell. And that's the point at which it becomes obvious that some people hear one pitch and other people hear another pitch. So what is the pitch of this? Again, pitch is a psychoacoustic phenomenon, which means that this thing does not have a pitch. My perception is what gives birth to pitch. Can I ask the question, what is the frequency of this Not really, because it has a huge amount of spectral components. So it does not have one frequency. Can I ask what is the fundamental frequency of this bell? Well, I can ask it, but it might be that I don't have a good answer. And the reason is that the harmonics and the spectral components in bell-type sounds are not integer multiples of any fundamental. So it's a mishmash of different fairly sinusoidal spectral components. So it gives you a sense of periodicity, of pitch, but they're all over the place, so different people will hear a different pitch. Okay? So just so you can relativize, and if someone says, that snare sounds horrible, then it's not like, well, you're either deaf or you really don't like me or, your girlfriend left you or something. It's the fact that we hear things radically differently. And especially because we don't really have a way of describing this with any accuracy. It remains a mystery how different it is. It's the same thing with colors, right? We are taught that this is brown. And there is no way of verifying how different the perception of brown may be for different people. Because we are taught to call it brown, and I ask you, what's the color? And you say, well, it's brown. And yeah, but it's brighter or not. Even brightness is questionable, I think, although that's probably a bit more obvious because there is dark, not seeing, and all the rest. But color is a similar thing. We all agree on the terms that are supposed to be used to describe it. But this does not mean that we see or hear the same thing. Okay? Interesting stuff there, I would consider. Okay, so that was a bit about pitch perception. Virtual pitch is an interesting thing. It's been kind of, a catchphrase for a lot of psychoacoustics in terms of, it's miraculous, and if you find some sensational psychoacoustics YouTube channel, they'll probably be like, oh, you don't believe it, but if we remove the fundamental frequency of a tone, you will still hear the pitch at that frequency. Now, the interesting thing is that if you have a series of harmonics, they will actually sync up at that period duration, which corresponds to the fundamental pitch, fundamental frequency. So even if I remove the spectral content, the synchronization of the neurons survives it. Because if I take all the harmonics, right, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and all the rest, they actually synchronize at the period duration of the missing fundamental. So initially, if you read an old psychoacoustic book or the Sensational Psychoacoustics YouTube channel, they will say, yes, but it's because the brain has the ability to replace the missing bits. Horrible nonsense. The way the neurology works is that you have sufficient trigger to constitute a sensation. So I can start removing aspects of things before there is insufficient stimuli for you to perceive something. There is very little in terms of reasoning that there is a replacement going on neurologically. So you will hear this replacement, and when you hear it, think about it. Okay, so there's a few interesting things there. In fact, the most interesting thing I would think about the missing fundamental is that if I have a melody, I don't even know what's the kind of a C major basic melody nursery rhyme here, but I take a C major nursery rhyme, and what I can do is I can take one tone and not just remove the fundamental, I can remove everything but a single harmonic, which means that instead of this, I actually get a sine wave at a much higher frequency. But if this is in the context of my nursery rhyme, I will hear the pitch. So even beyond being, robust to spectral content because of synchronicity of neurons, I am robust even to that synchronicity of neurons in the musical context. Because if the musical context is strong enough, I will actually hear a sine wave of a completely different frequency to be a note of a given pitch in the melody. You see, so that's how this whole huge hierarchy, huge amount of levels in terms of auditory perception actually acts as one, and there are back and forth feedback mechanisms everywhere, right? So that's why it's so difficult to reach down and actually critically listen to things. Because if you think you know what you're listening to, you are hearing what you think you hear. And that's just a matter of fact. So definitely dig into that. Okay, in terms of pitch perception, it is related. This is now a graph of critical bandwidths, how they change over spectrum. I won't go into this. The thing to note in terms of being knowledgeable is Bark scale, which comes from Barkhausen. I don't know if he's happy with shortening his name like that. But this is the frequency scale which actually is measured. So like we had Fletcher-Munson equal loudness contours, we actually have a pitch contour which is related to the way we hear it. So if we hear an octave in the bass, or, well, maybe octave is a bit of a stretch, but if we hear a major third in bass and we hear it in high frequencies, these are different sensations. We have learned to appreciate them as the same sensation, but we can measure that they are different. So, you know, the tuning of the bass is not as crucial. In fact, the interesting thing is that the tuning of the bass gives you a musical character rather than a sense of detuned. And obviously it has to be within some small boundaries. But try it. You know, you have a track and it's a bit dull because everything is pointillistic and it does the same thing that people have been doing for the last 20 years. You know, detune the bass a bit, you know, play with it, and suddenly you will see that, oh, it's growing character, it's becoming less bland without you hearing that it's out of tune or anything. Okay, very briefly, time perception. There is a thing called temporal integration window. Okay, so the hearing does not have the ability to separate moments in time. In fact, philosophy doesn't either. But in any case, with hearing, we have time windows which are considered as one, so to speak. And if you haven't been, probably most of you haven't been on the last Wednesday lecture on spectral analysis, it's on YouTube, watch it. I go into this into a bit more detail. The point being that you need time for frequency to exist. Okay, so you cannot analyze the presence of a frequency in a single moment. You can only analyze it within the duration of time within which it can exist, which is typically more than a split second. Okay, so the funny thing is with audition, there is a time integration, temporal integration time interval. And the funny thing that happens, for example, is that you may be confused in terms of which event happened first. Okay, so if I have a bell and I have a knock and I record them separately and then I edit them together within maybe 20-30 milliseconds and play them one thing first, then the next, and the other way around, you will have a random guess at which thing came first. Unless you are a percussionist, in which case you know the timbre of one flam in relation to the timbre of the other flam. But if you're not a percussionist, your guess is as good as random. You don't hear the sequence of events on very short timescales. Okay? And there's more, this huge amount of things about the time integration interval. In fact, one of my wet dreams is to do research on how it relates to my sense of time passing. So for example, probably the first half of this lecture went quite fast, but the last 5 minutes took a while. Okay, so your sense of how quickly the time passes, I think it's related to the time integration interval. The lucky thing is we can measure the time integration interval with autoacoustic emissions. So this is a whole other chapter in psychoacoustics, the fact that you can measure the ear without the subject declaring a thing, which saves the day, because who knows what you're saying and how much attention you're paying and all the rest. So you have a way of exciting the ear and measuring the response back in the ear, the autoacoustic emissions, and there's a whole lot of physiological estimations, measurements that you can perform with the subject who just doesn't do anything, just has a machine in his ear. So you can do, so hopefully one day my wet dream comes true. But in any case, there is also masking in time. So I can have a loud sound that masks another sound, not just in frequency while they're simultaneous, but also in time if something comes after the other. Okay, and then very briefly, stream segregation, peripheral channeling. If you're interested, these are your key terms. You can probably find a load of interesting lectures of this as well. The thing to note on stream segregation is that those are kind of perceptual mechanisms, so they relate to Gestalt principles, and here I have a few. Go through the slideshow, it will be fairly self-evident. I won't go into listening test methodologies. I've mentioned a few interesting things already. So I will close off with another thing that we can make a whole module on probably, which is the localization. Okay, so our ability to localize a sound source is amazing. It is much more accurate in front. I go down to 1 degree angle, whereas on the sides it's above 10 degrees in terms of confusion. Okay, so in front I can localize really well. Interesting things. This is an adaptive thing, so I can actually learn to adapt to anomalies, physical anomalies, physiological anomalies. There are things which are called ear flap prothesis. So I can stick some clay type stuff into my ear flaps to change the geometry of it. If I do this, the filtering characteristic of the ear flap will change. And if the filtering characteristic of the ear flap changes, my ability to recognize sound elevation is compromised largely. Because left-right distinction happens mostly with two main mechanisms. One has to do with the time delay, and the other one has to do with amplitude difference. Okay? In terms of this, the amplitude difference is more prominent for high frequencies. Okay, because my head acts as a filter for high frequencies much more so than low frequencies, something we've discussed. And the time difference, essentially phase difference, acts much better for low frequencies because 1 degree of phase difference for a low frequency signal takes much longer. So the time-based localization and the amplitude-based localization are the main things that typically are responsive for left-right. Now, elevation, if I elevate a sound source, it won't go louder or softer in one or the other ear. It won't go late in one or the other ear. So my perception relies on the filtering characteristic of the ear flap, and you see that it's actually asymmetrical vertically. Right? I mean, it's asymmetrical horizontally as well, which helps me distinguish between something left, half left front, or half right back. Because if I have two sources symmetrical like that, then the time difference is the same and the amplitude difference is the same. But the filtering characteristic is hugely different because the ear flap is kind of facing the rear sounds such that it filters them out. So what happens if I have this prothesis, within 2 weeks, I will relearn to appreciate the elevation of the sound source. And if I remove it, then again for a week or two, I'm lost in terms of sound elevation and I cannot perform. So actually the sound elevation perception can adapt to new set of ear flaps within 2 weeks. Quite exciting. Same thing happens with vision. If you wear glasses that make things upside down, it's really tricky for a week or two, and then your neurology will flip it. And then you take the glasses off, and then again you have things upside down for 2 weeks. Okay, so this is the adaptiveness of neurology like that. Okay, I think that's plenty. If you're interested, there's millions of things to research and to go through. So that's it for the theory. And then the exercises are online. As soon as you feel like getting started, I'll be seeing you in the respective rooms. Thank you.